so I'm going to show you a couple different construction methods when we're working with wire. I have in my studio, this is just some steel wire, picked it up at like Lowe's or Home Depot. Any hardware store should have some kind of wire. The wire you guys have in your kits, if you got it from Larkin or if you picked it up from a craft store, is probably going to be more aluminum. So it's going to be a little easier to work with. So if you see me kind of struggle in the video, it's just that the steel wire is a little bit more robust, right? So I'm just going to go over some basic construction methods. And then in a separate video, you guys are going to see me kind of have a more simplified armature. And I'm going to start wrapping the plaster over that, right? So just to kind of get, so you should have some kind of nippers. I have little clippies here. It does take a lot of kind of hand strength. So for when you first start out, you might have to like use both. And then obviously these are really small. So I know I'm going to struggle a little bit with just the thickness of the wire I have here. But I also have, usually in some of the needle nose pliers, you can have clippers towards the back as well, right? So there's a couple different options as far as like what you can use to clip, but just to kind of show you, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of, the wire is pretty easy to bend with my hands. It's the kind of making those small cuts and like breaking through when you need to. So I'm just going to kind of start by twisting a neck. I don't have a clear vision of exactly what I want to do, but we'll work on that. So I'm going to kind of bend one out, and I'm thinking I want something to stand maybe with like 3 or 4 legs, right? So I kind of have this twisted. Now I'm building for this demo just a very like simple armature, but you'll see in the other one that I'll have more kind of volume-esque or balloon frame one. 2 ways of working. You just have to figure out which one's best for you. So one thing you can do to kind of make sure that this doesn't pop open is wrap the wire. And this is where your pliers are really going to come in handy. I have a set like this. This is my favorite pair. I use this all the time. But I'm going to start bending and wrapping this wire. You guys can see what I'm talking about as far as like how much strength you kind of need. What you can do in lieu of that is kind of take a second pair of pliers, just because it can be hard to grip the wire by yourself. And when you're working, try to work close to the wire, and it helps to kind of torque both ways, right? So if I want that really kind of secure loop, you see how I'm really kind of wrapping just tight around the wire. That's what you're looking for when you want that kind of firm connection. Of course, I can always kind of take my pliers and kind of squish them this way and really kind of squeeze, right? So this is pretty attached. I know I bent my frame a little bit, but here we are. Good thing about wire is that it is a little flexible. Now, when you put the plaster wrap on it, it won't have as much flexibility. So if I want my other kind of foot, I'm going to clip just a little beyond what I think I might want. Might help to wear your safety goggles for this. I'm wearing my glasses, which any glasses wearers, they kind of double as safety goggles. So I'm just going to kind of bend this up. Now I have a foot. Now, any cut edge of wire, you can see more on this one, is going to have a really sharp edge. You can always take a file and kind of sand that down. So just be cautious when you are working with wire. You know, it can like cut you, get those, they're almost like little paper cuts, which is really painful, especially in the winter time. I'm trying to look around my studio. I don't know where my little file is, but there are files in the studio, so you don't have to worry about that. Alternative, you could always wrap a little bit of tape around it if it's something that you're not going to necessarily use later on. But you could also take sandpaper and just kind of rough down and kind of test it. It's not as pokey as it was a few moments ago, right? So that's always kind of a nice option, just to kind of like give it a nice file or a nice sand just really quickly. So, you know, it's not as dangerous to you as you're working, right? So I'm going to add that third leg. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of wrap around the middle here. And it takes a little bit of kind of playing around with the material to get it started. This isn't just like a one-off thing. You might have to struggle a little bit in the beginning. I've built a few wire armatures in the past, so, you know, it's always one of those things. It's like riding a bike. You have to kind of remember how to do it, but it helps to really kind of torque. And you guys can see that like I'm torquing pretty close. I'm using my other set of pliers to hold hold it down as it rolls off. That'll happen, right? And so that's something that you guys want to look out for, is that you kind of see that my connection as I'm working it isn't really taut. And that can happen if you don't really kind of torque and twist the wire that like taut like that. So keep that in mind. Now, this is one way to kind of do this. Another way is to kind of make almost like chain link connections. So almost like jump rings for jewelry or any other kind of like really small fabrication. Of course, you know, I could always get a soldering iron and solder these things together, but we're going to just use the wrap method for our purposes because we don't need it to be so perfect, right? And again, you guys are working with aluminum wire, so it's going to be a little easier to manipulate. Kind of squeeze that together. You see why squeezing that together, like, this isn't really going anywhere anymore. So I'm going to do a fourth leg actually, just so I have that support. It wiggled a little bit. I'll fix that. So one of the most important things too when you're building a little armature like this, two-hand strength, sometimes it helps to kind of wiggle it too. Clippers are just a little too small for the wire that I'm using. So when you're doing this, it's important to kind of be able to like not only go with the flow, but it doesn't have to be perfect, especially if you're doing a more like simple method construction like I'm doing for this demonstration, where I'm kind of just, it's almost like a line drawing, a continuous line drawing, something that you do probably in drawing class. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my other set of pliers, kind of hold that together as best I can. I'm going to try to wrap this around just to kind of give it that strength for that security. I don't want it to keep shifting on me. Now, although this wire is pretty malleable, right? And the gauge is pretty small. It's not super thick. It's a little easier to work with. Like if I had it any thicker, I'd be struggling even more. Kind of really torque and twist here. Get that joint tight. Better. It doesn't necessarily have endless limited bendability, so to speak. You keep twisting, like if I keep working this, it will snap eventually and kind of break off. So that's something to keep in mind too, is that, as you're working, try to limit as much as you can the amount of bends that you do, right? Because in the long run, you are going to have to, it will snap eventually, right? So this isn't the most, I'd like this just to be a little tighter. Now, obviously, like this could be fine. I'm going to wrap plaster around it. So if it's a little loose, like once I start adding that plaster, it'll stiffen up. But just kind of working and getting as closely to the kind of gauge of the wire and really fitting those wrapped moments tightly can help, right? So, one of the most important things with this, we're not necessarily going to make maquettes because I want you guys to have all of this time to kind of work on building your character, building the plaster up, building the bulk, but it's important to kind of think, have that kind of practice. So, if the first one, like, I don't even know if I would keep this if I was working, be like, I might just cut this off and start over. Keep that in mind as you're working, is that like you will go through a little bit of an experimentation phase. So it's okay if the first one doesn't quite make it, or you need to cut something apart and start over. That's kind of more of what this process will be like for the armature. Now, again, your guys' wire is not going to be nearly as hard to cut and or snap. I'm working with steel, you're working with aluminum. Aluminum's really, really soft, right? In a good way. So I'm going to just add some arms, because why not? Now, in the design phase, you guys are building like specific characters, right? So, your character doesn't have to be human-esque. It can be creature-esque. You can make your armature as detailed as you want it to be. And you guys can see I'm not even using my pliers. I'm just going to kind of wrap this wire around. That's something you can do too if the pliers kind of, especially if it's a simple armature you're going to completely cover in the long run, you don't need it to like look the greatest if it's all going to be covered in plaster. If you're going a route where maybe more of the wire is seen in the end result, then yeah, you should probably work on really trying to make that armature look as best as you possibly can. Something to consider too, you guys can see that he's leaning a little bit. It's leaning. We don't know what it is. So you have to think about the balance too. So this leg is honestly a little short. I'd probably like reattach him with something a little longer, right? But just for our demo's sake, just to kind of show you the possibilities. So if you're building this kind of simple armature, you are really thinking about a kind of stick figure or continuous line drawing with the wire. And some of the artist examples, not all of them are like, you know, building stop motion animation puppets or, you know, really kind of fully realized creatures. They're more kind of like line drawings with just wire, right? So these interior ones will be very kind of simple, right? Very stick figure-esque like. Why does this remind me of a bow truckle? I don't know. That really wasn't the intent, but here we are. And again, those other connections, you know, the chain, like the little loops or any kind of like jewelry joint is an option as well. And you can make those out of your aluminum wire. I'm not going to attempt them out of this very thick steel wire, but when we get to class and in person too, I will demonstrate again, just so for anyone that the video is kind of not doing it for them. But in a nutshell, basic kind of wire wrapping. And you can see, you know, the looser your kind of wrap is, the more mobility you'll have, which you will lose once we kind of wrap with the plaster cast. But if that's something you're looking for, you can kind of keep it loose. If you want it to not move and be really sturdy, you really have to wrap tight, and it helps to kind of torque from both ends. So having 2 sets of pliers is helpful. Even if you just have one, you know, there's plenty of pliers too in the classroom, and I have a bunch of these I can bring in. So in a nutshell, basic armature construction, and we'll go from there.